Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks for indulging me, if you will. We're gonna venture, like we haven't done today, right? A quick look at the future. I've been introduced as a futurist. I don't actually like that term, really. I don't know why Fabian, our splendid host today, chose that, because I understand myself much more as a historian, right? I'm looking at what happened in the future, what were past imaginations of the future. What did we imagine the future to be 50 years, 100 years, 150 years ago? Because that is actually quite instructive. That gives you a way to realign what your own forecasts for tomorrow are going to be. Whenever I think about exponential scales, about what the internet, what AI, what all those new technologies can bring us, I'm thrown back to this piece of art by an Italian anarchist design studio / art collective called Super Studio. And that was a proposal for the 1970 World Expo. It's called the Continuous Monument, and they imagined a globe-spanning hyper-object, a network that everybody can access, a network that will transmit information at once. Again, this was 1970. Our notion of computers looked like that. Just a couple of years before ARPANET was still a top secret, military intelligence research program was launched. This is what a quote-unquote modem looked like. This is what 5 megabytes were like in the time, right? That's 5 megabytes. Can you imagine doing your digital photography, your videography on this? And this was how the future of work was supposed to look like, right? This is how you work with computers. Of course, if we look at one of the most capitalized companies today and how their work with computers look like, it couldn't be further from our past notions of how that might look like. This is Facebook's headquarters, by the way. So we tend to overestimate the impact of technologies in the short term and tend to severely underestimate the impact of technologies in the long term. And I'd caveat that is that the degree with which we overestimate and underestimate is quite different. So what we overestimate has a different quality than the underestimation in the long run. But we're here to talk about the Exponential Society, and we've heard a lot about that, right? So we might want to take a bit of a look back, have a look at Moore's Law, the, dare I say, mother of all exponentials, right? Framed in the late 90s, late 60s, by Gordon Moore, co-founder of Intel, basically one of the leading heads of why we're all here, the integrated circuit. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. We've talked about science fiction as turning into self-fulfilling prophecies earlier today. This is what we're really talking about, right? Processors doubling in speed and capacity at same cost every 2 years. And if you just look at the marketing material, it still holds up quite remarkably well to this day. This is, of course, Apple's iPhone launch event. So that made us to go from these computers as expensive, building-consuming entities used to compute the flight paths of intercontinental ballistic missiles, retailing for, I think the Cray 2 was about $35 million inflation adjusted, to this, a computer on your smartwatch, on your watch, on your wrist, that you can actually talk to. That's the nature of exponential change. We're talking about artificial intelligence. But before we go into that, I want to take you on a little side story, an aside, if you will. Who knows who this guy is? We're at an AI conference. There should be like 50% of people should be raising their hand. That's way too few. Okay, you need to read up. That's Andrew Ng. He used to, so we were talking about that DFKI launched a deep learning thing online. So he co-founded Coursera, one of the first MOOCs, if you will, and lately he headed Baidu's artificial intelligence research lab. So he's a guy who really knows what he's doing, and he had Baidu's resources to pursue it, right? So he was one of the at the best place we can be for AI. He had a presentation, I think, 2 months ago, where he said, AI will transform the world the way electricity did. And we've heard that before in the video that introed this whole day, right? And I'm like, hang on. Not only have I heard this one before, this was about Internet of Things, where I started my practice in. Now we do much more emerging tech. But so, with the IoT, given enough time, we won't really think about them as connected to the network anymore, much as we don't think about electricity as, a special product requirement. Of course, that's not really what he meant, right? What he meant was this. What he meant ubiquity and massive change. And so it might be prudent to look back at how electricity actually developed, right? I mean, we take all this lighting for granted, but it's really due to this guy, Thomas Alva Edison, who then got in their fisticuffs with those guys, Westinghouse and Tesla, over which platform, which protocol, if you will, should be used for distribution of electricity. Vested economic interests, stuff got really nasty. They killed a couple of elephants as presentation how awful alternating current is. Tesla, for a long time, forgotten, kind of resurfaced thanks to those guys. But what we forget is what a sea change electrification actually was. It was a huge political mandate behind that. There was a whole ideology based around that fact, right? It doesn't really work out that well, though. And it led to huge concentration, as energy tends to do. It led to military applications. This is the Demon Core. If you've never heard of it, I encourage you to look it up. The Demon Core, the story is mind-boggling. This is a subcritical plutonium core that they just, experimented with. 2 people died because of, sudden criticality and a crazy radiation exposure. I quite like that image because it reminds me of how nonchalant we talk about, potential implications and experimentations with AI. This is something we might want to consider. The military applications of, potential electricity generation were quite obvious. I mean, this is the explosion. I think it's 10 milliseconds after the Trinity test site explosion. Led to nuclear power, massive upfront cost, massive capex investment, if you will, concentration effects across the electricity industry, and then this happened, right? I mean, we had Chernobyl, we had always our issue with nuclear, but Fukushima really broke it. And so ever since, we're in the massively contrarian direction, right? Solar is going through the roof, wind is getting ever cheaper, and our forecasters can't keep up. If you look at the official off-jump statistics on what UK and the British are not renowned for their generous subsidy scheme for photovoltaics installations. If you just look at how poor the forecasting works out there, it's crazy. Average prices for energy go down, average prices for batteries go down, and suddenly, there you have it. That's almost exponential change, if you look at it. And suddenly, those guys are rewriting, the second time, a whole industry. To the tune that the Bank of England, not known to be the most alarmist or most progressive entity in the world, is warning about the macroeconomic impact of the carbon bubble. Because so much of our current valuations is tied up in future revenue flows, and just looking at what happened to US coal is mind-boggling. Top 4 US coal stocks over the last 4 years lost 99% of their value. That is what you communicate if you equate artificial intelligence to electricity. This is the history that you imply if you say AI is going to be the next electricity. We've been talking about exponential change, right? And artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence actually coined at a, I'm quite surprised it didn't come up before today, at a now famous conference in Dartmouth, US, not UK, in 1956, where they figured it couldn't be too hard to completely model how the brain works, right? Should be done in a couple of years with a generous research grant. We're still nowhere close, as we've just heard, right? But if we model just the time and the growth that passed in between, and we gotta be careful, the Dartmouth conference was before even Moore's law existed, right? Before we had a notion of what an integrated semiconductor is. But if we look at this time span, over 60 years, compute power on an integrated circuit would have been increased by not 10x, not 100x, not even 1,000,000x, but by just a bit more than 1 billionx. That's the nature of exponential change. And that's making it so hard to forecast the future. Now, of course, we've heard all about the applications, right? Self-driving is a thing. Voice-activated is a thing. And note the words I've chosen, right? Because that is one of the problems in AI research that you will encounter. Once it works, nobody talks about it as artificial intelligence anymore, right? Self-driving cars is self-driving cars. It's not artificial intelligence. Voice-activated systems are your voice assistant. That's not artificial intelligence. But you want to know what we're going to look at in 2030, don't you? Well, let's have a look. One thing to bear in mind when you look at the future is if you focus on just one dimension, or just one factor, one variable, you're bound to imagine these futures, right? That's always a bit lazy. So let's have a look at 4 more or less plausible scenarios for what we could encounter in a short 13 years from now. The first one has been discussed at length. Today, preceding weeks, months, it's the mother of exponentials, it's the singularity, and we're not talking about these kinds of singularities, although, you know, the proponents kind of want to push that similarity. You all know who this guy is, right? Who doesn't know who this guy is? No hand? Good, I'll take that. Of course, the technological singularity, AI is getting ever better and ever faster, and once it hits the threshold, it's getting better, faster than we can control, or we can get better, and hence we have a runaway artificial intelligence which is going to rule us all. Basically, the nightmare scenario. It's possible. To some extent, it's even plausible. Certainly not preferable. Let's have a look at the second scenario. We're going to get into more interesting scenarios, right? We've just talked about self-driving, right? Self-driving is going to rewrite the industry. There's no two questions about that. But what self-driving and electric really are is innovation across inputs. And if you look at, you know, a newsroom circa 1980, and we all know news is in the gutter. Financially, intellectually, news has a problem. But if you look at the inputs, not that much has changed, right? It's gotten more efficient, but the core product, how it's made, doesn't really change, hasn't really changed. What really changes is what happens on the outputs, right? Digital distribution made all the difference, and if you're working on any kind of future forward-facing capacity, I encourage you I really encourage you to have a close look, pay attention to what's happening in media and music. Because media and music were the first content types, first products, if you will, to go online because the data is native to the medium. News and music is the canary in the coal mine for all industries where digitalization happens. That's as an aside. What we mean in this scenario is basically there's not so much going to be an exponential, but a sigmoidal curve. If you're in PR, if you're in market research, marketing, what have you, you've seen this chart. You've heard of early adopters. You've heard of the early majority. That comes out of agricultural research and kind of showcases the diffusion of new technology through industries. What's really interesting, though, is if you apply Carlota Perez's theory of how innovation happens to the sigmoidal curve, you have the innovation on inputs and then outputs, and usually a big chasm of financial crisis in the middle. So that's probably what's going to happen in scenario 2. What's good to bear in mind there is the differentiation between innovation on inputs of a product and outputs of a product. And Clay Shirky probably said it best. I mean, he applies it to communications tools, but really it applies to anything. You can't really innovate across user behaviors if the technological foundations are still unsettled. That's why Facebook couldn't emerge in the 90s, but only in the 2000s, because everybody had internet access, right? We didn't have to worry about 56K modems anymore. And that's true across a wider media and internet ecosystem, as long as, you know, the technological solution situation of internet access was unsolved. There was no room for innovation on the output layer. Now let's have a look at another scenario. We're getting into slightly multivariate world now. I think this is what has people really worried. It's the centralization scenario, right? It's the future of automation. A lot of people like to talk about data as the new oil. And we've just talked about what we imply when we talk about AI as the new electricity. So I want you to think about what meaning people carry over when they talk about data as the new oil. Because most likely they're talking about centralization effects, right? We're arguing right now that, you know, the web is leading to a whole new class of monopolists where traditional antitrust approaches aren't really effective. We're worrying about AI as supplanting us, making us, our future a jobless future. There's one guy in that picture. Has anybody spotted him yet? Because if you think and if you buy into the notion as data as the new oil, you're assuming implicitly that there is going to be huge upfront investment and centralization effects, which is going to turn our cherished world of strong middle classes, of we're in Germany, a strong Mittelstand as the backbone of the economy, into a world ruled by power laws. And on a lot of internet platforms, we already observe that, right? That's a worry right now in policy. It's a very plausible scenario, averages over. And if you haven't read Piketty, or at least heard of Piketty, and you worry about the effects of automation, I encourage you to read that book, or at least the introduction, because it's a big book. And now, the fourth scenario, probably my favorite, probably the longest to expand on, is a world of asymmetries. We've talked about, how renewable power prices go down, and go down like crazy. Talked about battery packs decreasing in price like crazy. We've talked about Moore's law, which, drives down the cost of computation quite severely. And taken together, These are three deflationary price pressures that make access to technology so damn cheap. And what happens if access to technology gets cheaper and cheaper is that we like to pretend that it enables all this massive creativity. But it also leads to a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I don't have to tell you that we're living in a quite volatile world. As a political scientist, the last couple of months have kind of been mind-blowing just in the speed of unraveling. And we know this, right? We know that technology enables this kind of massive uncertainty change. Disruption theory was the first one to put the finger on it. Ever since Christensen put out his book, the lifetime of a typical S&P 500 firm has decreased by about a third. So with that in mind, the deflationary pressures of technology, we might want to have a look at what AI could be like. Is it really going to be like electricity on the changes, or is it going to be more like that? Gutenberg's printing press, of course, 1492, that changed the course of history, right? Germany, we're celebrating this year 500 years of this guy putting 95 grievances against the door of some church, which then led to 30 years of atrocious war. Oh, that was one too fast. And ended in the Treaty of Westphal, which is the very basis on which we now think as nation states, right? The whole international order is basically a function of Gutenberg inventing the printing press. That was a time of massive volatility and uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, no doubt. So, I'm a political scientist. I trained in international relations with a focus on what we then called new wars, what is now commonly known as asymmetric warfare. This is an aerial shot of Baghdad, by the way. We know how this works out already. Consumer drones, a luxury 5 years ago, are now used not in Baghdad, but in Mosul as insurgency weapons, right? They're dropping grenades. The US military is on record that one of their close allies actually shot down one of these drones. They cost $200 with a Patriot unit, with a price tag of about 1.3 million US dollars. That's bloody messed up economics. If we're looking at the future of AI under deflationary price pressures, under assumptions of decentralization, we're going to end up in a messed up world. There's malware right now, not Mirai. Mirai was just interesting because of the externalities involved, that is actively seeking out whether the computer that infects has been infected by other malware and removes it. So in all the scenarios we're talking about, why do we think AIs will cooperate, for instance? And what happens if we just forecast the cost reduction, the access of cheap energy for a couple of years when everybody can train their own AI? These are 4 scenarios, 4 more or less plausible scenarios, just, to lighten up the mood a little. Pick your poison. There's 2 things I really want to leave you with. I mean, I know these futures can be depressing, is these 2. First, we tend to severely overestimate the effects of technology in the short term and severely underestimate the effects in the long term. Secondly, we can only really innovate over user behaviors, over the outputs of any given system, once we've settled the technical challenges on the inputs level. And with that, I thank you all for being here. Fabian will be right up here with the panel. Thank you.